Once you have your block drawn, you can begin carving. So I'm going to show you a couple different techniques for carving and kind of go over the materials too. The first thing is the bench hook that we have, and this comes in your printmaking kit. The bench hook has a hook on the top and a hook that comes down from the bottom, and this is so that you can prop your block up against it. So if you just push it over the edge of your table, that will hold it still so that when you're carving your block won't move while you're carving. So it's a little bit better for safety. The carving tool is the Speedball lino cutter, and if you unscrew the handle, that's where the little tips or blades are for carving. So you can take those out, screw that back in. To put the tips in to the tool, there's a little metal tip on here, and you just unscrew it a little bit to loosen it, and then you can slide the bit into place. It basically fits between the little ball bearing inside there. Sometimes you gotta unscrew it a little bit extra to get it in, kind of wiggle it a little bit, and it should go. And then you just screw it back to tighten it. And you should be able to tighten it enough that it doesn't wiggle at all when you move the tool. You want to try to avoid accidentally unscrewing it all the way, but it does happen. Sometimes the tool can get a little bit stuck in there, so you can purposely unscrew it all the way to help you get the tool out. So if you do unscrew that all the way, the reason why you want to avoid it is that it has those little extra parts inside. So there's two little halves that fit together. So if you do take it completely apart, just look at those two halves, see how they fit together. There's a rounded tip on one side, and you just take that rounded tip, put it in the bottom of that piece, and then screw it back onto your handle. So it's not a big deal if it does come undone. Now for the tips, zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see, but it comes with 5 different tips. The base part that goes into the handle is the part that has writing on it, so you should be able to see the writing on there, and each tip is numbered. So our number 1 tip is a very, very small V gouge, and our number 2 is a larger V gouge. And by V gouge, I mean that the tip of it that actually makes the mark is shaped like a V. And then the number 3 is a small U gouge. Number 4 is our little carving tool. Oh, nope. Okay, so it's 1, 2, 3, and then 5 is our large U gouge. So U gouge, the tip kind of looks like that. And then our number 6 tool is just a blade for cutting. So I'll kind of go over what each of those do when I'm carving on the block. So let me zoom back out here. Push those tools to the side. Get my bench hook ready, and then I'll put my block. You can see some of the marks I've already carved on my block, and this is why we stain the block. So I stained it red so that when I start carving, the marks that have already been carved come up as that light pink, like the color of the Speedy Carve, and the rest of it stays red so I can see what has been carved and what hasn't yet. Always remember, number 1 thing is you are carving the red areas out and you're leaving the black areas alone. So let me start off with the large U gouge tool, or the number 5. And I'm just feeding it into the tip there, tightening it, and then making sure that there's not any wiggle to it. And my block is pushed up against the edge of the bench hook, and I can start carving with my U-gouge. The U-gouge is great for 2 things. For one, it's good for clearing out large areas of white space. So let me just show you. And the way that I'm pushing the tool keep in mind I'm using both hands. My right hand is my dominant hand, and you'll notice that the tool kind of fits in the palm of your hand there. And so what I'm doing is I'm pushing with my right hand, the dominant hand. With the left hand, I'm using my fingers on the tool to guide it, to steer it. So pushing with the right hand, steering with the left. And what this is doing is it's keeping all of my fingers and hands outside of the direction of the blade. These are very, very sharp tips on here, and you don't want to accidentally cut yourself. The number one way that people cut themselves with a tool is that they're not paying attention. They're like holding the block and then carving into their other hand. So you want to be really, really careful with that. And the best way to do it is just to have both hands on the tool, and then you never will have a hand in front of the tool where you could accidentally hurt yourself. So the large U-gouge, good for clearing out big wide spaces like that. If you need to make like a little dot mark or a circle, what you can do is you can stick the tool into the block a little bit and then kind of spin the block, and then that will create kind of a little dimple in there. There we go. So if you're looking to create kind of like a circular or like a pock mark, you can do that. So that is the large U-shaped tool. The small U-shaped tool does the same thing, just a little bit finer. And then the V-gouges, which are my personal favorite, are for creating nice good lines. So, and you'll see I'm having trouble getting the tip out here, so I might just unscrew the whole thing, kind of jiggle that around a little bit. Then I can pull the tool out and just reattach that. And then I'm gonna I'll put the larger of the V-gouges on, which would be the number 2. So, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to get that in place. So tightened on there, it's not jiggling, and I'm good to carve. So again, pushing your block up against the edge of the bench hook so that it doesn't move on you. And the V-gouge, like I said, is really good for making lines, and it's really good for, so if I've got like a black line right here, I don't want to carve the line itself, I want to carve all the red areas next to it. So I'm just going to take my V-gouge, and again, pushing with my dominant hand and steering with my non-dominant hand. You end up with all these little bits over here, and you can just toss those, throw them away afterwards. You might have to sweep or mop under you later. As far as how deep to carve, because after we finish this, we're gonna roll ink on top of it and then pull a print. And so to determine how deep to carve, I generally tell people that you need to be able to catch it with your fingernail. So if you glide your fingernail across it and your fingernail catches, even if you have short fingernails, it should catch really easily and well. Then you're pretty good. I generally tell people don't carve more than halfway through, so try to avoid carving too far. If you carve too far through, it just becomes a little bit fragile and it can kind of fall apart on you. So be careful with that stuff. Some other things to keep in mind too, if you carve a line that is too thin or too small, or you're worried about it, you can go back over it. So like I carved a very, very small shallow mark there, and you can just take that tool and go right back over it to go a little bit deeper or a little bit wider to make that line show up better. Also think about the direction that you're carving in. So right now the shape of this skull is rounded in this direction, so really I want my lines to be carved following that same direction, and that'll create like a cross contour kind of look to it. You'll notice right here in this dark shadow area, I started doing cross hatching with the tool. Keep in mind that when you're cross hatching with a marker, you're creating those black marks all over. But when you're cross hatching with a tool, you're doing the opposite. You're creating little white marks everywhere. So when you're drawing with a marker, you got to start in the dark area and make your way to the light. And when you're carving with the tool, you want to start in the light area and make your way to the darker areas. So let me give you an example. We'll carve this area out right here. So in the lighter area, I can make wider, deeper, and closer together marks. But then as I start getting into the darker areas, I want my lines to be thinner, smaller, and further apart as I start getting closer to those darker areas. And that goes for both directions. So down here, the lines can be pretty wide and close together. And then as I start to get closer to the dark shadows, you want those lines to be a little bit further apart. So just a little example right there. The other thing to keep in mind too is, like, if you have a very large open white areas, I try not to just completely carve everything out. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. So like for this area right here, carving in between here, instead of trying as hard as I can to carve everything out from this section, I'll kind of leave some of these raised up areas in between, and those can pick up a little bit of ink, and they create this kind of background texture that we call chatter. And chatter is pretty unique to printmaking. See if you can see those little in-between lines. So that chatter, that can pick up a little bit of ink, and it can create this really unique texture to printmaking and relief specifically that that can really activate that negative space a lot. So I try and keep those in until I'm printing. And then usually when you first ink up the block, you'll see how much ink that chatter will pick up. And so sometimes I'll carve a little bit more out. But just remember, if you carve it all out right in the beginning, you can never put it back. You can only carve more away. So I like to be a little bit careful with how much I take out in the beginning. But that's pretty much all that I wanted to talk about with it. So be careful with your tools, both hands on the tools at the same time. Use that little bench hook while you're carving. Try to follow the direction of the forms that you're carving while you're carving them. And if you have any questions, let me know.